now know, the FTC is the leading federal agency charged with protecting the public from deceptive or unfair business practices and unfair methods of competition. Today, our topic is all about buying cars. And a new rule that we believe is going to protect all of us as we go through this process from scams. The rule is called the Combating Auto Retail Scams, spelled CARS for short, rule. Combating Auto Retail Scams rule, which requires transparency in the vehicle shopping process. It will also generate major savings for consumers, possibly as much as $3.4 billion a year. And it will save consumers an estimated 72 million hours each year. Today's briefing will explain how it will do this. It is a rule that includes key provisions about pricing, add-on products and services, as well as buyers' consent. Here to explain to you what you need to know to share with your audiences are three speakers from the FTC. Malini Mittal, Associate Director, Division of Financial Practices with the FTC. Jamie D. Brooks, Attorney, Division of Financial Practices, also FTC. And Sonia Sharasby, Attorney, Division of Financial Practices, the Federal Trade Commission. We ask speakers to speak slowly, as I am, for interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters enter questions in the chat. Our speakers will answer questions in the chat as they have time and feel they have particularly relevant information to share. We will be sending a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker. And once again, Rosario Mendez, Assistant Director of Consumer and Business Education at the Bureau of Consumer Protections with the FTC, is willing to provide Spanish language one-on-one interviews if we can set them up easily with requests from you. So there are ways of doing follow-up interviews with each of our speakers, and including in Spanish. Before we begin, I have a key question to ask Rosario Mendez, and that arises from a mistake we made in the invitation. We confused the word fraud, consumer fraud, with the word consumer scam. And she pointed out there's a real difference between fraud and scam. And I would like to ask Rosario, tell us very briefly what that difference is.
And Rosario, if you'd prefer, I'm happy to chime in on this topic. It's up to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. That was Rosario passing that along from us. We were the ones who made that change, Sandy.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm happy to talk about that. So, you know,
Okay.
there's not actually so much difference. A lot of times if someone is lying to you about a product, that's fraudulent behavior. That's a fraud. It can be called a scam as well. The reason we use the term scam is sometimes it's a little bit broader. Sometimes people think the word fraud has to include intent, that you did something on purpose. which is not necessarily what's needed under the FTC Act. We're very focused on what a consumer thinks, regardless of whether the speaker was intending something or not. So we are very concerned about the consumer and focused on the consumer. And so we just use the broader word scams a lot of the time. Is that helpful?
So fraud is more of a legal term.
Some consider it that way. And I wonder that if we call something a fraud, if people are going to say we have to use different legal standards in court. But in our day-to-day speaking, I think scam is a broad word that encompasses fraud and other illegal conduct.
That's great and very helpful for all of us to know. That helps me in how I think about future FTC invites. So thank you. Rosario, please do help monitor the chat. You provide excellent kind of response as people ask questions. So thank you for joining us. So now we will begin with an overview from Malini Mittal, whom you just heard from. Thank you, Malini, and go for it.
Okay, thanks so much, Sandy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear what we have to say today. Like Sandy said, I'm Malini Mittal, and I'm with the Federal Trade Commission, but I do have to make a quick disclaimer. The remarks we're making today are our own. We are staff, and we are not speaking on behalf of the commission or any individual commissioner. All right, with that, let's get started, and let's dive right in. So what did the FTC announce this week? Slide 2, please. The FTC announced the CARS rule, combating auto retail scams. The CARS rule focuses on two very harmful practices that we've seen consumers experience. First, bait and switch tactics. That's where dealers advertise a certain term, like a low price, to get you to come to the lot. But once you spend the time driving out there and you spend hours on the lot, you learn that the car is way more expensive than what was advertised. That's called a bait and switch scam. The second scam that the rule aims at combating is junk fees. So as Sandy was saying before the call officially started, auto contracts are long, they're complicated, it's a long transaction. Unfortunately, it can be easy to hide charges in those contracts for things that the dealer and the consumer have never spoken about and the consumer doesn't really want. Now, Jamie and Sonia are going to talk more about bait and switch and junk fees. But before we get into more details on what the rule says, I want to talk about who this affects and why people should care. Dan, can you turn it to slide 2? So the rule should help car buyers save $3.4 billion a year and 72 million hours in shopping time. And that's not all. Next slide. The rule also specifically helps service members who need cars to get around sprawling military bases. The CARS rule means that they will be able to make this essential, expensive purchase without worrying about tricks or traps, so they can focus on protecting us and our country. The rule also helps honest dealers who will be able to compete on a level playing field. They won't have to worry about losing business to a competitor that is pretending to have a lower price to lure consumers onto their lot, but then charging much more once the consumer gets there. All right, next slide. So now let's dive into what the CARS rule says. First, dealers can't lie. So no lies about key information like costs, financing terms, add-ons, rebates, etc. Second, dealers must tell consumers the offering price. That's the actual price anyone can buy the car for. They also have to tell consumers they don't have to pay for extra items on top of that price for things like service contracts. And also, if they talk about monthly payments, which can look very small, they have to tell the consumers the total they will pay. So for example, if they're saying the monthly payment is only a couple of $100, but they're assuming that your contract lasts for 10 years, they've got to tell you that total price or that total payment amount. Okay, third, no junk fees. So dealers cannot charge for items that provide no benefit to the consumer. Some examples here are duplicative warranties, where you already have a warranty on the car, but the dealer's trying to sell you another warranty that doesn't give you any extra coverage. Another example is if the dealer tries to sell you products or services that are incompatible with your car, so you can't use them at all. So things like that would be if you're buying an electric vehicle, a service contract for oil changes. That's a good example. Dealers, fourth, can only charge for items if consumers know what the charge is for and they agree to pay for it. So no more hiding charges in contracts. And those are the 4 key pillars of the auto rule, of the cars rule. That is it. These 4 principles are what we really want everyone to remember today. Okay, now we're going to talk more about the whys. Next slide. So I'm going to start with why the FTC is so focused on cars. Then I'm going to turn it over to Jamie and Sonia to answer the remaining whys that I have posted here. Why is the FTC focused on bait and switch tactics? And why is the FTC focused on junk fees? All right, next slide. So why is the FTC focused on cars? So cars are one of the most expensive purchases a consumer will ever make. For many consumers, buying a car is the second largest purchase after buying a home. Now, I'm going to talk more about costs and how they're increasing in a moment. But first, I want to note that having a car, in addition to being expensive, is also essential. People rely on cars to get to work, school, doctor's offices, grocery stores, medical visits, and other important tasks in their daily lives. And cars have become increasingly costly. The average price of a new car sold at a new dealership last year was $46,000. For a used car, it was $30,000. By the second quarter of this year, average monthly payment for new cars reached $741, and for used cars, $533 a month. Those are both record highs. In fact, cars are now many consumers' largest expense, on par with housing, childcare, and food. Given these costs, many consumers finance their auto purchases. And auto finance is actually the 3rd largest source of debt for United States consumers. And service members have an average of twice as much auto debt as civilians. So another reason we're so focused on this space, besides the expense and importance, is the process of buying or leasing a vehicle is often time-consuming and complicated. It can take several hours or even days to finalize a transaction. People need to take time off of work, arrange for childcare to go buy a new car. And in each of the past 4 years, the FTC has received a lot of complaints about this process, more than 100,000 complaints about vehicles. Complaints about vehicle transactions are regularly in the top 10 complaint categories tracked by the FTC. And for military consumers also, auto-related complaints are among the top 10 complaint categories outside of identity theft. So our law enforcement experience, I want to mention, also shows that not all consumers complain. So for every complaint we get, there are many, many, many more consumers whose voices go unheard. So in this way, even though we have a large number of complaints, they still understate how big the problem is. With that, I will turn it over to Jamie.
Let
Thanks,
me just hold on and let me remind people that Jamie D. Brooks is also with the Division of Financial Practices for the FTC and is an attorney. Go ahead, Jamie.
Sure. Thanks, Sandy, and thanks, Melanie. So as Melanie mentioned, the rule focuses on combating 2 harmful practices, bait and switch tactics and junk fees. Why did the FTC focus on these practices? Let's start with bait and switch. Bait and switch advertising is where dealers advertise one price to get consumers in the door, but then charge consumers much more after they've invested their time traveling to the dealership and spent hours on the lot. The FTC has brought many actions against auto dealers engaged in deceptive advertising, including bait and switch. For instance, the FTC has charged dealers with making misrepresentations about the price of a vehicle, the monthly payment, and about an affiliation with government programs. So let's look at a few examples. Turning to the next slide. Here we have casino auto sales, and you can see the dealer advertised vehicles with a specific low price, for example, $18,000. And that was to get buyers in the door. But at the very bottom of the ad, the dealer buried some fine print. And if you pull that out, you can see that it says the buyer actually has to pay an additional $5,000 down payment on top of the advertised price. And you can see that in our slide. That's deceptive because when a customer sees an advertisement that prominently displays a price for a specific vehicle, they can reasonably expect to pay that price regardless of the fine print. And as you can see, the advertisements here, I don't know if you can see because they're a little small, but they're in Spanish, specifically targeting Spanish-speaking consumers. So turning now to the next slide, which is Paramount Kia. Here, the dealer put out a video advertising $0 down and only $99 a month. That's the low monthly payment Malini mentioned. But the ad had fine print that you can only read if you freeze the video, which we've done in this slide. It said, actually, only the first 3 payments are $99. For 69 out of the 72 payments, the buyer would have to pay a much higher monthly payment, over $500, at an APR over 9% plus an administrative fee. Those terms are not clear from this ad. So people may choose this dealer expecting to pay $99 a month instead of going to other dealers who tell the truth about their prices. As one last example, let's look at traffic jam events on the next slide. Here, the FTC sued a dealer ad agency that sent out deceptive mailers, supposedly directing consumers to a COVID-19 stimulus relief program. The mailers used a mock check that you can see here and what looked like a United States seal to lure consumers to a designated location. But when consumers arrived, they only found a car lot hosting a sale. So this is another example where car dealers use bait and switch advertising to get customers in the door. These deceptive tactics can cause real harm to consumers who waste significant time and money visiting dealerships and may not discover the deception or the real price of the car until after they've spent hours traveling to the dealership and on the lot, if at all. They also disadvantage honest dealers who have to compete with bogus prices. When a dealership advertises low prices, people end up selecting that dealership over others under false pretenses. So what does the rule do to combat bait and switch? Here are some of the things. As Malini mentioned, it prohibits misrepresentations. This means dealers can't lie about key information like cost and financing terms, or if they are affiliated with the government or the military. Second, dealers must tell consumers the offering price, which is the actual price that anyone can pay to get the car. That means a dealer can't advertise a car for $18,000, but then tell you in fine print or when you get to the dealership, that's on top of a substantial down payment. Dealers also have to tell you the total payment if they quote a monthly payment. And any disclosure the dealer makes needs to be easily understandable. One thing that means is that if a dealer is advertising or negotiating in one language, the disclosure has to be in that same language. So a dealer can't negotiate a deal at one price in Spanish and then add a bunch of additional charges or terms in documents that are in English. So turning to the next slide, here's what people had to say about these protections. And Sandy, I know this is something you asked about. What thousands of people commented on the rule when we proposed it, and they urged the FTC to bring greater transparency to the car buying process. People said they dreaded car shopping, and many specifically voiced concern about deceptive ads and bait and switch pricing. So if you take a look, one comment said, a consumer should be able to see a price, walk into a dealership, and pay that price. Many members also wrote in. For instance, one retired officer said, I can't list the number of times I have seen car dealers take advantage of a young military member or their family by baiting and switching when it came to the price of a car. Many dealers also expressed frustration, having to compete with the price of dishonest dealers. For instance, we heard from a small family-owned used car dealership in Iowa who was in favor of the rule and noted that dealerships take advantage of consumers by advertising low pricing when in reality they add on thousands to the out-the-door price. Small dealers usually have to compete with those advertised prices. And that's why we focused on bait and switch tactics. I see we had a question about the language component and someone asked me to repeat that. So that was just that any disclosure needs to be easily understandable. And that means that if you are advertising or negotiating in one language, if an advertisement is in Spanish and disclosures are needed, those disclosures must also be in Spanish. That's true if you're advertising in one language, and that's true if you're negotiating in one language. It also means that consumers need to understand what they are agreeing to. And if they don't understand the deal consummating documents because they're not in a language they understand, that would not be assent. So those are some of the reasons we focused on bait and switch tactics. I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to talk about junk fees.
Sonia, please go ahead. This is fascinating, and I don't want to interrupt the three of you.
Thank you, Sandy, and thanks, Jamie. So why did we focus on junk fees? Well, we were concerned that people were paying for junk fees, and these include additional items that provide no benefit or items that consumers don't know about or don't want. Dan, could you change the slide, please? So first, for a little bit of background, what do we mean when we say additional items? We mean add-ons. And these add-ons can include things like extended warranties, guaranteed automobile or asset protection, also called gap agreements, VIN etching, exterior or interior coatings that are supposed to protect the vehicle, and many more. Slide, please. So individual add-ons can cost consumers thousands of dollars and can significantly increase the overall cost to the consumer in the transaction. In the past 2 years alone, dealers have substantially increased prices for these add-ons, even though such products and services largely are not constrained by supply. A significant consumer protection concern is that consumers are paying for add-on without knowing about them or expressly agreeing to them. The long paperwork-heavy vehicle shopping process can make it difficult for consumers to spot these add-on charges, particularly when advertised prices or payment terms don't mention add-ons at all. So for example, a recent FTC law enforcement action, we had consumers visiting a dealership that were required to complete a stack of paperwork that ran more than 60 pages long and required more than a dozen signatures. This type of conduct can target immigrants, communities of color, and service members. For example, we've brought cases against dealers we've said hid charges for add-ons people didn't want in their contracts or charged more for the advertised price, and they did this more often with Black, Latino, and American Indian consumers. Or that they charged those consumers more for the same add-on products. In other instances, dealers might wait until late in the transaction to mention add-ons and do so in a misleading manner. Dealers have also represented that add-ons are required when in fact they are not, and have misrepresented the purported benefits of such add-ons. So in fact, another recent FTC enforcement action, the commission cited a survey finding that 83% of consumers from a specific dealership were charged for add-ons that they did not authorize or were as a result of deceptive claims. And I just wanted to share one what one consumer had said. So this consumer paid for a $2,000 service contract that the dealer said was free, and a $900 gap agreement that the dealer said was mandatory to complete the purchase. The consumer only learned about these charges once they got home, so after the deal was finalized. And they said, I'm quoting, "I feel I've been taken advantage of, to be honest with you. They only let you skim through the paperwork. You're so tired, you're so worn down, you don't want to be there. They take advantage of that. They never lose, they never lose." So here are some of the things the rule does to combat these junk fees. The first thing is dealers can't charge junk fees for items that provide no benefit to the consumer, like a duplicative warranty or items that are incompatible with the car. The dealer can charge for items only if the consumer knows what the charge is for and agrees to pay for it. And on the next slide, we have some additional comments that we received from consumers, military members, and even dealership employees. So the first one, the consumer notes that they made me sign the sales bill on an electronic device, never pointed me to the number I was getting charged for. They rushed through the electronic pages in a hurry, straight to the signature box, and they charged me for things I never agreed on. A military consumer noted that when purchasing their first car, it set me back financially for years. I know many young military people who purchased vehicles and were instantly so far upside down after leaving the dealership with thousands of dollars in add-on junk charges. And lastly is from a dealership employee who expressed that none of us working here at the dealership in sales benefit from these practices, and that they cringe every time a customer comes in. And you can read the rest of the quote there. And it says that at the end, it says, we hope that the regulators understand the positive implications this would have for dealership employees, both financially and mentally. So those were some of the things we were hearing. This concludes our portion of the presentation. I'll just point us to the next slide, where we have our consumer education resources. And if you encounter any of these practices, any issues, please share your experience with us on the link, the last link below.
Hi, these were 3 terrific presentations. We have lots of questions. We have 3 questions right in a row that I'm going to start with, but I think just before we go to our audience questions, one generic question. What do we do between now and when this rule goes into effect? And can you say a little about the reasons for why it won't actually take effect until next year, the middle of next year? Malini, yes.
Yes, I'm happy to answer those questions. So an interesting thing about the auto rule or the cars rule is it prohibits very specific conduct. And the new rule means that it's easier for us to get money back for consumers. But these practices are already illegal. Dealers already should not be lying to you about the price. So for example, I think Seema had a question about how, she was quoted a price of the car, and then she was told that she also had to buy paint protection on top of that. If they're telling you a price of the car, that has to be the price. They're already violating the FTC Act. So, you could tell them you're going to report them to the FTC, and please do report them to the FTC. We rely on consumer reports to bring law enforcement actions and get results for consumers. So already these practices are things that dealers should be doing. The other thing is, because the rule makes it easier for us to get money back for consumers, that means dealers are probably going to make more efforts to comply with the law. They'll already be changing their practices if they're not doing these things already. And so we expect to see some positive results from the rule even now, even though it's not going into effect for a few months. The effective date just means that when we sue them, right now we can't say that they violated the rule. We have to wait a few months before we can do that. That gives them time to come into compliance if they need to, but they should not be engaging in this conduct. You know, honest dealers don't have anything to worry about. They can continue business as usual. But for the people that are, you know, playing fast and loose and tricking consumers, they need to stop that now.
Let me ask Henrietta Burrows, can you ask your question, which follows very effectively the question Seema asked?
Yes, thank you, Sandy. When the FTC goes after car dealerships that break the law and they give money back to the consumer, would this be in a class action suit, or would the money given back be specifically to reimburse those consumers who were ripped off?
What a great question. So the FTC, when we sue a company and we get money back, we return that to consumers without the need for a class action. So we, you know, look at the victims, we figure out who all purchased the cars at the higher prices, et cetera, and we put money back in people's pockets. Some recent examples where we've done that lately, the Napleton case is a case that we sued a large Chicago multi-state actually dealership. We got $10 million back for consumers, and we announced that we returned that money to consumers, I think a couple of weeks ago.
Did they keep the cars?
There's no requirement in that case that they return the cars or anything like that. They don't get the full price of the car back. They get the full price of things like, you know, the extra amounts they paid.
Thank you.
The question, though, is for you as an individual consumer who got ripped off. How do you handle it? Do you go back and quote the CARS rule and say you're going to report this to the FTC unless you get compensation? That's a scary thing to do. How do you report this to the dealer and or to the FTC, and roughly how long will it take for the FTC to act so that you get your own money refunded for the scam that was perpetrated?
Okay, so those are excellent questions, Sandy. So I'll start with some tips for consumers. So consumers, ask the dealers the price of the car from before you get on the lot to the moment you're on the lot. If they're not willing to provide you that sort of information, walk away. If it's unrealistic for you to walk away and you feel like you're going to have to, you know, move forward with the transaction, then tell the dealer that you know your rights, you know, you don't want to pay for any extra items, that they should be honoring the price, etc., and tell them you will report to the FTC if you're not nervous doing that. If you are nervous, you can still report to us. So you go to our website, go to reportfraud.ftc.gov, and you report to us what happened. And then what we do is we use complaints to decide which law enforcement actions to bring. We don't act on every individual complaint, but if a certain number of consumers complain about a particular practice, or we're seeing that there's a large dollar amount of harm at stake or other things, then we will bring cases. And once we bring a case, we sue the company. We either settle with them or we go to court. And in court, once we get a result, we get money back from the dealership, then we mail redress checks to consumers. And that's exactly what we did in the Napleton action that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago.
Great. We have a question from Elena with Slavic News in Sacramento. Elena, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. So the main question is, and I think Malini already partially answered that. So if the car buyer, the customer purchased the car and find out that he or she pays over than he or she was promised at the dealer salon, what are the further actions? Should the person come back to the dealer and say, hey, look, you overcharged me, or should file a report? Or so So what should be done? How the person should deal with this? Thank you.
Sure. So again, it's really important to report to the FTC. Now, I can't give individual legal advice to consumers. I can just tell you if you report to the FTC, we take these complaints very seriously. I can just tell you from speaking from my own personal experience, when I find out that I paid for something that I didn't need to, that I think I was overcharged for, I do call the company and I let them know if I'm going to complain to the authorities. So, those are actions consumers could take, but, I can't get into very specific legal advice, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have a question from Floyd Galloway. Floyd, could you ask your question?
Okay. Can you hear me? I think you can hear me.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. My question is, are there certain states or regions that have more auto scams than others because of state laws or laws in reference to protecting consumers?
What a great question. I don't know that I know if that there are certain states with more issues than others. Like you're guessing, there are states with different laws. So for example, some states do require disclosure of an offering price, just the way the FTC rule does. And we looked carefully at what other states require as we decided what would work best for consumers across the nation.
Okay, thank you.
But there have been statistics, I think, when we did a special briefing for Native American media, it was highlighted that Native Americans were particularly targeted for auto scams, auto retail scams. And I think all of us are interested in any sort of information you can give us about particular groups, ethnic groups, racial groups that are most vulnerable to this.
Yeah. Okay, so state by state, I don't have any kind of information on that. But if we're talking about classes across states, what I can share is that we have seen that when consumers are hit with hidden fees, junk items, things like that, we have seen that occur more with certain populations. So for example, in the Napleton action I referenced earlier, we saw that they were charging consumers for add-ons without their consent or by lying and saying they were required. And we found out that not only were they doing those things, but they were charging Black consumers for those add-ons more often and in higher amounts. So kind of add insult to the injury. It was already not wanted, according to our complaint, but then Black consumers paid more for them and more often. In another action we brought, oh, go ahead, Sandy.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so in another action that we announced, I believe it was last year, against Passport Auto Group, we saw that they told consumers the price of the car. And then when consumers came to the lot, they said, actually, you have to pay, thousands more dollars to get that car. So they were already charging these bogus fees or double charging for them. And we saw that they were doing that more frequently with Black and Latino consumers. So that's an area where we saw that those classes were paying even more for the cars than other consumers. Another example is our very recent action. I think it's from about a month ago against the Rhinelander Auto Group, which is an auto sales group, auto dealer group that's in Wisconsin near Native American tribal lands. And we saw that they were charging Native American consumers more for unwanted add-ons than other consumers. So those are examples where we've seen this issue. And Sandy, I also just want to mention military consumers is another area where we've seen particular problems in this market. And that could be for a number of reasons. So for many military consumers, they're moving to these sprawling military bases where they need a car to get around. They're younger individuals. It might be the first time they're earning a paycheck. They might not have as much of a credit history. So they might be particularly an attractive target for predatory dealerships. And in fact, DoD, the Department of Defense, spoke very favorably about our rule and said that this rule should help with military readiness. So that was good to hear. But in any event, we have seen these kind of practices occur in the military community as well.
We have a question from Renee Barbie that speaks to, again, direct experience. Renee, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Sandy. let me scroll up and see. My daughter and son-in-law bought a used car from CarMax. They have had to deal with 2 car payments per month, and they were not aware what that would do to their finances, especially since they were homeless at the time. My question is, are dealerships like CarMax allowed to make their customers make 2 payments per month for the duration of the contract? They can't afford it and are falling behind in their payments. I haven't researched it yet, but to me, this seems wrong. Please advise. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the question. So companies can't lie to consumers. If they're telling them that you have to make 1 payment a month and they're charging 2 payments a month, that violates the law. That's true whether you're an auto dealer or another company. That's true under the CARS rule, and it's true under the FTC Act. Companies cannot be charging consumers more often or in higher amounts than what they told the consumer they would do. It's very, very important to make sure that dealers are behaving in a manner with consumers that is honest, without tricks or traps. That's not only good for consumers, but for honest auto dealers as well.
We have a question now where the reporter wants to know, is there a list of the car dealers that have been found guilty of these deceptive practices for each state so people can check and avoid? It's kind of like a list of shame on you, car dealers, but is there such a list?
So there's information available about our cases on our website. There's not one list necessarily together. And I see Seema's comment, so I'm smiling about it. She says I can add a few names if it exists. I think one issue is there's so many car dealers out there, and we bring as many actions as we can, but I wouldn't want it to seem that we've necessarily said that other dealers are good or bad. Right? So even if we've sued 10, 20 dealerships, that's not making a comment about the other thousands of dealerships that are out there. And by the way, before we turn it back over to other questions, I do just want to add, it is very, it's both kind of disappointing to hear all these stories about, what everyone's been going through, what their kids are going through, that they're making all these car payments they didn't know about. And it's very, very, disappointing. That should not be happening. And I'm really sorry to hear that. And it also makes me really happy that we're doing this. I think it will have a real consumer impact. We really want to see improvements for consumers. We want to see improvements for auto dealers. And so, this is something that the agency is very proud that we've done.
Malini, can you, for the benefit of a few of our media who joined late, just repeat that this CARS rule applies across the board to all states, but one of our reporters asks whether it also applies to territories. I mean, geographically, this would apply to basically all parts of the United States.
That's right. It applies across the nation.
And also an important question which was answered in the chat, but I think it really would be very useful for all of us to hear. How did this idea for the CARS rule originate? How far back have you been planning? Because as you say, much of this behavior already is illegal, but you felt the necessity to issue this rule to provide greater transparency.
Absolutely, Sandy. So the FTC has prioritized protecting consumers in the car market for years. We've brought a number of cases. We've done education. We've done outreach. And after years and years of these efforts, we saw that problems with bait and switch tactics and junk fees just kept happening. And because of that, we decided to take an extra step of issuing a very specific rule that requires 4 things of dealers that I talked about earlier. And we thought it was important to do that to make it very clear. The FTC is very focused on this conduct, and we're very eager to get money back to consumers. So for those reasons, we announced a rule now.
A question from Karamula. Grumrow, do you want to ask your question? It relates to the fact that new immigrants are often the most vulnerable to some of these practices. Caramulo, otherwise I'll read it for the interests of time. New immigrants get more problems getting cars from auto dealers because of credit scores and many other associated issues. Could you highlight, and for also our other two speakers, Jamie and Sonia, would you want to do a special focus on issues facing new immigrant car buyers?
Oh, thank you, Sandy. I'm actually happy to answer that for all of us. I think these are really important topics, and we really do appreciate coordinating with you and thinking about what topics would be the most useful for people on these calls. So we're happy to chat after this call about, you know, other kinds of conversations and discussions we should have. I will tell you, we worry about this issue as well, about, you know, all these practices are bad enough as it is. And then, you know, if there's a certain population or group experiencing it even more, that's all the more disheartening. So one of the things that Jamie mentioned is that our rule requires that things like the price, things like you don't have to buy extra products, things like total payments, they have to be very clear to consumers. They have to be easily understandable. So that means if you're transacting with the consumer in one language, but then making the disclosures in another language, that's not something we'd say the consumer would understand. So we'd say that disclosure wasn't clear. That would be a problem under this rule. And in general, just by limiting, curbing these kinds of bad tactics that we are concerned about, we expect this rule to help consumers across the board, including in specific communities.
A question from Raymond Tyler. Raymond, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Besides fines, are there any things punitive that can be done to dealers to discourage them from continuing these practices?
So with the FTC, we are very focused on getting money back to consumers, even more than, you know, punitive fines. But the recourse we have there is fines. You're exactly right that we can get penalties when people violate a rule. We look at the kinds of violations, how severe the practices were, and we can take all those things into account when seeking particular fines amounts. But that is the punitive thing we would do at the FTC. Otherwise, our focus is on money back in consumers' pockets.
We have a question from Michelle White Mendoza, which I think raises a critical question for all of us as many of us handle ads from car dealerships. So her question is, do scams usually happen when the person goes to the auto dealer, or are scams being promoted to people in other ways? Which I think, by which he means, I think, advertising. So what is your advice to us as people who do sell ads for car dealerships? How closely do we have to look at the content of the ads we're publishing?
Okay, let me start with the first piece about whether this is happening in person. You'll see from our cases that we've brought, what we generally see is that there's just a variety of ways that dealers might want to lure consumers to come to their lot. And then a lot of issues that we have seen have taken place on the lot. You know, things like jacking up the price once you get there. Things like, you know, waiting until hours into the transaction to mention something else that you supposedly have to buy, or burying charges in these long contracts that you're signing at the end of an already kind of long day. Now, in terms of the advertising itself, you know, starting in that first instance, you know, I think something that is important is if, you know, we have taken actions against advertisers that make problematic claims. So for example, one of the cases that Jamie brought up earlier was our action against traffic jam, where they had sent out a COVID mailer saying, oh, look, we have COVID relief for you. And you'd come to where they were and you'd see, wait a minute, this is a lot selling a used car sale. So that is an advertising agency that we went after. We said that it was luring people to the lots and making these claims that weren't true. And we actually sued them and won, and that matter is on appeal.
Wow, that's what is how would you, let's say we get an ad that we think has the danger of really scamming people, like the $99 a month. How, given that we're not in the business of doing forensic research on each and every ad we do, should we run it? Is there somebody we can run it by to get verification? Should we contact a local or regional office of the FTC in our region?
So, one key thing is if you are seeing a practice that you are worried is a scam, then I know I'm going to say it several times, even in the time we have remaining, but please report it to the FTC. Even if you're not sure, please report it. We really, really, really rely on complaints. It's a huge market. There's so many dealers. We only hear from a fraction of customers, as I mentioned earlier. Every time we get one complaint, there could be many, many, many more complaints out there that are never going to be heard. So it's very, very important to let the FTC know. Now, as for the topic of kind of, what kind of due diligence, media outlets should be doing before they run various ads, I think that the best thing to do is to take a look at our cases like traffic jam. There was another case that we brought against Passport. I know I mentioned that action earlier, but we sued that company twice. Our first action against that company is they were sending mailers that said urgent safety recall notice, and it was not a car that needed a recall fix. They were just trying to get you to the lot. And we sued the company and the advertisers there as well. So I would take a close look at those cases if you're worried. But otherwise, I think that this is a whole separate topic that is kind of different from some of the things we're talking about with respect to the rule. The rule really covers auto dealers.
Right. A question from Nancy Tran, which has to do with how easy it is if one has limited English proficiency and you're trying to make sense out of a voluminous contract that isn't, let's say, in the language are there language access requirements? And I think you've covered this either in this briefing or previous briefings, but maybe you could again remind us what are the language access requirements.
Yeah. And first, I will talk about the language access requirements, but first I just want to say this is a big concern. I mean, even if documents in a car transaction are in your first language, they can be hard to understand. I mean, that's a concern we've heard across the board, regardless of what language people speak. And I can only imagine having to read an auto contract in another language. I can only imagine reading something in Hindi and trying to make sense of it. And I just, that's very, very daunting. So a key part of the rule is that we have said that car dealers, when they are telling you something, if they're negotiating in one language, advertising in one language, and they need to make a disclosure, that disclosure has to be in the same language as the ad. So, for example, or as the communication. So for example, Jamie gave you an example from Casino Auto Scales. They were using a mix of English and Spanish. That's something, we've taken companies to task for. It's very important. If you're saying one thing, but then you're saying, actually, that's not really what I meant, you have to say those things in the same language. Anything short of that is going to leave your customers confused, and that's a problem.
Well, we have, I think, so many good questions, and thank you so much for excellent presentations and for preparing the slides. I want to remind all our media colleagues that we will be sending a video with a rough transcript of the video, as well as the slides that were presented today, so that we can kind of use them for reference in preparing reports. I would like to ask each of our speakers for final thoughts. It is the holiday season. People do think of sometimes purchasing cars as gifts, and many of us are thinking of lease for purchase, which we haven't specifically addressed. I'm not sure if that requires any different kind of approach when it's a lease for purchase contract as opposed to a straight out purchase. But I would just say, what single point are you most anxious to have us headline in our reports about the CARS rule?
Absolutely.
We're asking in a way for you to help us write our headline.
Yes, I think it would definitely be the first few points we made. So the CARS rule combats bait and switch tactics and hidden charges, issues that we've seen for years. And we estimate that these protections will save consumers $3.4 billion per year and 72 million hours in shopping time.
And a quick follow-up to that before I go to our other two speakers. Why do you think the CARS rule, which essentially is underscoring deceptive scams that have already been illegal, why do you think it's going to make a real difference? What is it about issuing this order that you think will take enforcement of the rules against these scams to the next level?
Because it comes with money. I think people stand up and take note when they are on the hook for a lot of money. It's easier to get money back to consumers with this rule. And I think once dealers see that they have that exposure, if they violate the law, that might encourage them to be on the right side of the law, like many other dealers are. And we hope to improve circumstances for those honest dealers as well.
Thank you. That's a terrific response. Let me go to Jamie Brooks. What would your headline be for this? And you can repeat what your colleagues have said, or you can give it your own twist.
I would just say that I think this rule is really going to help consumers, and it's going to help honest dealers by leveling the playing field so they don't have to compete with bogus prices.
Great. Sonia Sharasby.
Thanks, Sandy. I'll echo what my colleague said and also really stress that I think that these 4 pillars of this provision will really change the marketplace for the better for consumers. It's particularly the offering price provision. We're really hoping that this will make a difference when it comes to car shopping.
And repeat that again. The offering price has to be transparent. This is part of the push for transparency. Could you just rephrase it in very common use language?
We hope the offering price will make the car shopping experience better and more transparent for consumers.
Terrific. And I would add one message from the chat from Jennifer Leach with the FTC. Jessica, can you unmute Jennifer? And Jennifer, you have the last word. You always have a great headline suggestion. Okay, so I'm putting you on.
Hi, Sandy. I was really agreeing with Jamie, which is the CARS rule protects people and honest dealers.
Yes,
Bottom line.
Yes, I think so. Look, this is just so, this is just such a great pleasure to have our oldest, longest partner, the Federal Trade Commission, with whom we've worked since 2015 through a meeting that I had with Jennifer in Hartford at a national consumer rights conference. to be able to end
Sandy, I think you're muted.
I'm not sure how that happened. That wasn't me. I'm just saying it's really an honor to have our last briefing of the year with our very valued longtime partner, the Federal Trade Commission. Thank you so much for making this a really very clear, transparent, and so valuable for all of us as reporters and consumers, news you can use briefing. Our conference is now adjourned, and with best wishes to all for the holidays. Thank you.